Hi, my name is Mike Doran from the Hudson Institute. I'm a senior fellow here, and we'd like to welcome you to a program on the Middle East and great power competition. We have a really exciting panel today. Leading off is David Schenker from the State Department. He's the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. That makes him the senior most official responsible for the Middle East. Hello, Assistant Secretary Schenker.
Hi, Mike. Dr. Doran, it's good to see you.
Great to see you. And secondly, we have Miles Yu. Professor Yu teaches at the Naval Academy, and he is the Principal China Policy and Planning Advisor to Secretary of State Pompeo. And last but not least, we have Glenn Howard. He's the CEO and the president of the Jamestown Foundation, a very venerable think tank here in Washington. Hello, Professor Yu, and hello, Glenn.
Hi, Mike.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So let's start off with you, Assistant Secretary Schenker. The Trump administration tells us that we are in an era of great power competition. Could you just lay out for us what that means with regard to the Middle East? Is the Middle East a major arena of this competition? And if so, what is the nature of the competition in the region?
Well, thanks, Mike. Listen, it's no secret you got the NDS that talks about major strategic threats, challenges to the United States, and that is China and Russia, as indicated in the defense strategy. But that also plays out, across the globe, and part of that in the Middle East. So with China, the key issue here is the nexus between China and Iran. Chinese entities that support the theocratic regime, weapons sales, smuggling of illicit goods, etc., and providing cover for Tehran in much of its activities. These exacerbates regional tensions. The other part is Russia, and Russia certainly plays out in the region. China and Russia on arms sales, looking for arms sales, but Russia, through its presence, first and foremost, in Syria, where it has, with 40 fixed-wing aircraft, changed the course of the war, helped the Assad regime to perpetrate what appears to be or resembles a genocide, and killing over 500,000 civilians in that country, and now emboldened, moving on to Libya, where it's looking to create a base on NATO's southern flank. So I think there is a distinct occurrence of this great power competition, global power competition playing out in the region every day.
So, Secretary Schenker, if I could just stick with you for a second. You started out and you discussed the Chinese-Russian, the Chinese-Iranian connection. And then you moved to Russia and you talked about Russia's role in Syria, where, of course, there's a Russian-Iranian connection as well. Should we be conceiving of the region as the United States versus an alliance between China, Russia, and Iran, or should we be thinking of Syria and the Chinese-Iranian nexus as one arena, and the Russian-Iranian nexus in Syria as a separate arena?
So I think that Russia and China share some common objectives vis-a-vis the United States, and there is obviously the intersection with Iran. I don't know if you can call it an alliance, but certainly as we try and pursue our interests in the region, which include, stability, security, economic prosperity, good governance, democracy. These states certainly are looking to oppose that, and where they can, stick their fingers in our eye and undermine our efforts to and long-standing partnerships.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yu. Uh, could you give us the perspective from Beijing? What does the Middle East look like when you're sitting in Xi Jinping's shoes?
Well, the Middle East was considered as the predominant American sphere of influence by Beijing for a long time. So they consider that as an area where the U.S. has a long engagement with the strong alliance uh, and has a great national commitment to. There is interpretation for a long while was because American industrial machine needs oil. So Middle East is actually very important for the Chinese to avoid strategically. So what they're looking for the strategic weaknesses of the in the area where the U.S. is not strong. So that's why initially, in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, uh, they invest heavily in the area that U.S. they consider not very active and predominant. That is Africa, and then later on is Central Asia. Okay, so this is straight from their long-held Leninistic doctrine, the theory called the weakest link of international capitalism. So, however, there is a paradox here that is also from the beginning of this administration that we announced the Great Power Competition, which is epitomized in the December 2017 National Security Strategy, and subsequently the NDS, as Assistant Secretary Schenker mentioned earlier. So what that means that document said, you know what, United States strategic interest is no longer be involved in a prolonged struggle in the Middle East against the loosely organized, mostly stateless terrorists. We're going to focus now on great power competition. We name particularly 4 major countries, sovereign threats: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So we have this tendency to disengage ourselves strategically from predominance in preponderance in Middle East, and to reallocate our strategic calculus as well as our assets to deal with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So China sees that as as an opportunity, and then they march into the Middle East like they have never been before. And coupling that is the Trump administration's policy of energy independence. So we have achieved quite a bit of the energy independence. That's why no matter what happened in the world oil markets, the prices at the pump remain more or less stable. So because of that, our less reliance in the Middle East. So the China sees that as an opportunity. So they actually moving quite aggressively. The Premier Li Keqiang made several trips to strike many deal over there. So, and of course they're going to exploit the Iranian situation as well. And we push back really harsh. So I would say that's from Beijing's perspective. This is what happened in their sort of a chessboard.
So if I could stay with you as well, just for a moment, you said something. You said a number of things there that are very interesting. I'll come back to, but I want to hit one right now. You said this is straight out of the Leninist playbook, but yet we become accustomed to thinking of China now as a capitalist country. Could you just talk a little bit about the what would you call it? The hybrid conception of the leaders at the top of being simultaneously Leninist and capitalist. How does that work?
Well, it works this way. China is a capitalist country in the sense that most of Chinese ordinary people do not really give any credence to the Marxist theory, and they were instead into are very actively pursue all these status symbols of capitalist, the bourgeois lifestyle. So that's the ordinary Chinese people. However, the ruling class, the elites, they deeply believe in the Marxist-Leninist fundamental tenets. So their government, the Chinese government actions, domestic and globally, are strictly guided by some of the very basic tenets of Marxist-Leninist and their Chinese versions of the communist theory. Xi Jinping is a very good example. So most of the actions on Belt and Road, for example, and then their trade talk, and you can trace some of the ideological sources of many of their actions. And this is the inner core, their policy, and their strategic paranoia over American hegemony, over Americans' contentment against the rising socialist country, really is palpable if you talk to the inner circles of Beijing elites, those decision makers. So there is kind of a dichotomy here. On the one hand, the nation as a whole do not adhere to Marxist-Leninist theory, but the ruling elites, the people who control 100% of the political power in China, and they do believe in that.
It's fascinating. Glenn, over to you. Could I ask you to give us the perspective from Moscow? If you're Moscow and you're looking at the Middle East, how do you understand this triangle of relations between yourself and Beijing and Tehran, and or maybe the quadrilateral with Beijing, Tehran, and the United States?
Well, Mike, I think the way to look at the picture is that it is very geopolitical in the way the Russians look at the Middle East, and it's always about great power pretensions, where Russia, and being the descendant of the Soviet Union, wants to restore its status within the region, and that's done an excellent job doing that and filling regional gaps in security and filling security vacuums. A case's point was when their intervention in Syria, which caught us by surprise and very much led to a deepening involvement by the Russians in Syria, using their military power and using their elements of their air power. And the way that, and then what they did after consolidating is they looked for gaps in the regional security, and then they saw the situation in Libya. They've always using different mechanisms at their disposal, and this is where they were. They're not in the image of the Soviet Union. They're developing new tools for using proxies like Wagner mercenaries to put boots on the ground to try to change the situation. But this is where they've tried to act in the region, and they played. Secretary Gates once said they're playing a weak hand of poker, but they're playing it very good. And this has always been the way the Russians have been kind of reacting. And I think when you look at their intervention in Libya, I mean, you had what was ironic about the Berlin meeting in January is that you had two non-European powers, Turkey and Russia, dictating to the Europeans the whole security situation and negotiations over Libya. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to create in Libya a frozen conflict similar to what's going on in Ukraine and the parts of the former Soviet Union by interdicting and intervening in Western and Eastern Libya and trying to set up a position there to be able to counter the Turks and play a role. It's not necessarily mean that they're going to gamble everything on Libya, but they want a seat at the table, and they'll do everything possible to kind of thwart that and using their proxies. But the problem has been is now they're met the Turks and Erdogan in Libya, and basically they have, it's now may grind to a standstill. And I think this is the issue for U.S. policymakers is what happens when things in Libya go head to head and then grind to a standstill, and where are we regionally? Are we going to be the broker bringing everybody together to try to resolve the situation, or will the Turks resort to military means, what I call offensive realpolitik, which is what Putin and Erdogan are using against each other to further their goals? But for Russia, I would say that Libya is peripheral to their national security interests or core. But for Turkey, it's certainly a part of their emerging core national security interests in Eastern Med. And they're certainly, with their naval power and their air power, capable of trying to change the situation on the battlefield to their favor. And so this is where, my final point is none of this would have happened with Russian meddling in the Mediterranean without the invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014. That Crimea became a power projection platform for them into the Mediterranean, just as it was for Russia after Catherine the Great annexed Crimea in 1783. They became a problem in the Mediterranean just at that time for the British, and now you've got 6 kilo subs chasing after U.S. carrier battle groups inside the Med, and they're becoming more of a meddlesome presence. And if they get air power in Libya, that can also be a long-term problem as well for the United States. I'll stop there.
Glenn, that's great. I'm going to come back to you later on the question of Turkey. But let me just ask you now, about the great power component of this. When Putin is looking at the Middle East and he sees the Chinese inroads into the region and the U.S. Chinese tension, is he seeing himself as a third force, or is he seeing himself as an ally of the Chinese, or something in between?
No, I'd say it's a third force. It's all about what we call in European diplomacy the balance of power. I mean, he's trying to change the balance of power to his favor, or at least have a seat at the table. But he knows he's playing a weak hand in Libya. He has a strong hand in Syria, but he met his match in Idlib in February. So the situation there has changed. And it's basically, they're at a standstill in Syria. And now he sees a gap in security and trying to move. But in terms of China, it's all about him wanting to work in tandem with China to deter the United States, which they view as a sole superpower. And they want to change that. And they're trying to change the regional security. But it is, as Professor Miles Yu said, they're not trying to. China, I think, now is developing an interest in the Mediterranean as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And starting to have interest, and Russia's balancing with China. I mean, it's very obvious, but I would say in Libya, I'd say China is probably playing a very neutral role, with the exception of their wing-lung drones that they're using to fight against the Turks in the air. So that's also another interesting subcomponent of all this.
So back to you, Secretary Schenker. When you read the analyses by experts these days, there's sort of two major themes, contradictory themes, actually, that you see people saying. One is that in this era of great power competition, with China especially engaging in this extensive military buildup and also competing with us for economic innovation, and with us having now a very large domestic oil production capability, the Middle East just isn't that important anymore, and we should be looking to lighten our footprint there even more. Some people are even calling for pulling up stakes and leaving the region altogether. Another contradictory line of reasoning says that actually the competition with China is not that important in the Middle East because the Chinese actually value the role of the United States there because it allows them to avoid the difficult security questions. They're dependent on Middle Eastern oil to a very large extent. And what they really want is to penetrate the region economically. And as long as the United States is going to foot the bill for the security questions, then we don't really have to worry about competing with them. I wonder if you could address these two themes and sort of place administration thinking in relation to them.
Well, thanks. Listen, Mike, there's this sort of old saying, what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the region, doesn't stay in the Middle East, whether that's oil or problems of migration or terrorism. These are not self-confined, and when things go sideways in the region, it doesn't stay there. It is true that we have to balance, I think, all our commitments around the world, and we have to prioritize, and this is a constant juggling act. But we still have abiding interests and priorities and allies in the region. That hasn't changed. We have been working for years to try and increase the capabilities of our partners so that as they stand more on their own 2 feet, we can decrease our commitments militarily or count on them or burden share. And this is something that I think every administration has tried to do, but this still requires a large U.S. presence in the region. And, our presence is both, military, but it is also, economic. And these type of relationships, these partnering relationships that, help build capacity, help ensure the stability of these states. and are good for everyone. I think we are still seen as a partner of choice for most of the states in the region, in the Gulf in particular, but North Africa as well, and Levant. I was in China before I had this job years ago, maybe I don't know, 10 years ago, and we're talking to the Chinese academics about how they saw their role in the Middle East. Obviously, they cannot project power like we can just yet. But they are very pleased at this arrangement of, as you point out, U.S. security umbrella and all the economic opportunities that is available to them. They are, and they acknowledge it, freeloaders, right? And there are some, just thinking out loud, there are some who say, well, maybe it wouldn't be bad if China had to have a pay-for basis. Right, these things are enormously expensive. They're a large burden, and it's a drain. Right, we can do it. We're an enormous economy. I'm not saying that's what our thinking is, but it's a great cost to have this presence. But no, the competition is there, and it is in the region, and so not militarily, but we are looking at competition for example, you see the hearts and minds. Right, so the Chinese are appealing, I think, to some countries because there are no strings attached in terms of values, right, in terms of democracy, in terms of human rights, right? This is just not ever a concern for them, right? They have a million Uyghurs in concentration camps there, right? This is not an issue for them. On the other hand, they do debt traps. They do all kinds of things that are incredibly, have a really negative and pernicious account. They leverage their investments, et cetera. And if you can't pay, they get you in a debt trap. That's happening in the Middle East. It's not just in Djibouti that it's happening. And getting 99-year lease on a port in your country. They realize they're at a bit of a deficit because although they are trying to exploit the coronavirus to get it into the region and get a bigger foothold in the region, the countries aren't buying it, right? It's so clear when they come with large shipment of PPE or tests that don't work, or gear that is not up to a standard. People see through that. They also know that China was, not transparent in about the virus, and kept WHO out of Wuhan for months. Have not turned over the first strain of the virus to the international community. They see all these things and they weigh them. But countries also increasingly are aware that if you do business with China, that you are essentially doing business with the Chinese Communist Party. So if you do business with Huawei, then all of your data is the property of the Chinese Communist Party. If you take a Chinese COVID test, your DNA is the property of the Communist Party there. There is no such thing as privacy or independent companies. They are all have their relationship to the state. So we're playing out this competition, and we are, I think, letting people know how we see it. And I think states in the region increasingly are taking that on board.
Thank you. Professor Yu, let's go back to the view from Beijing, but this time put the emphasis on the role of the Russians in the Middle East. And perhaps if you could put it in a kind of wider context of the role of Russia and China in general. On the one hand, some experts are telling us that the new aggressiveness in Xi Jinping's China is going to be very threatening to Russia, and we can sort of count on a Russian counter reaction. Against that, a lot of others are saying that Russia is actually already in an alliance with China. How do you understand it, and how should the United States respond?
Well, Russia and China both are malign actors in many areas in the world. But there's a fundamental difference. Uh, they both have global agenda. Russia's global agenda is to regain global relevance. China's global agenda is to gain global dominance. And that's a very different agenda. And Russia does not like American dominance in the world, for sure. But Russia also hates Chinese dominance. And the reasons are very, very complicated. And Russia, first of all, and China are neighbors. And Russia and China historically has a lot of animosity. And as many of the border issues were settled on paper, but the underlying currents between these two nations were really, really runs deep. And Russia is extremely vulnerable in Far East. And that's where China plays a much stronger hand. So they are fundamentally worried about China eroding Russia from the East. And also, strategically, in terms of geopolitics, and Russia is very unhappy with China in many, many aspects. Number one, Russia has some very traditional friends in Asia, in the region. Those traditional friends all are adversaries of China. You name it, Vietnam and India are very good examples. So every time China buys weapons from Russia, and Russia needs cash, primarily because of the Crimea gambit, Russia also sells similar weapons to China's adversaries in the region, Vietnam and India in particular. So, and Russia also is very worried about China's inroads into the Central Asia area through Belt and Road. Russia is never happy about that. And remember, in the 1990s, China and Russia started this Shanghai Cooperative Organization, the SCOs. And presumably at the time, Russia was the big brother. But gradually, China is getting control of this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So China now is a predominant figure in this alliance. Russia is not very happy about that. And most importantly, you can see Russia had this ambitious plan to have a sort of a economic zone of its own, call it the Euro-Asia Economic Community. And there are 4 members of that key to Vladimir Putin: Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. China has tried its best to pull these countries away from Russia, and particularly Kazakhstan and Ukraine. And Yanukovych basically sold the country's security blanket to the Chinese. So that's one of the very important background for Putin to basically to annex Crimea. This is something that very few people pay attention to. And you can see in the South China Sea, Russia also is very unhappy about China. So Putin actually summoned all the ASEAN leaders to Sochi a couple of years ago to have the summit. If you look at this statement at the end of this Sochi summit about Southeast Asia, it reads pretty much like from the State Department of the United States. You know, there's talking about the freedom of navigation and mutual respect for international law. So Putin is playing very strong hand in that. And most importantly, Putin also fancies himself as some kind of Japan expert, judo, all sorts of things. So he is actually has the strongest willing in recent Russian history to have a good relationship with Japan. And Japan is also eager to have good relationship with Russia in order to check China's rise. And if there were not for Crimea crisis, Russia and Japan probably would have ended up signing some kind of treaty, peace treaty already. So all in all, Russia is being very, very careful about China. The so-called Russia-China alliance is on paper only. I don't believe for a moment that's really of any substance. And Russia has steadfastly refused to sign any alliance deal with the Chinese. Chinese know it. So all in all, I said there's some competition, there's some common interest, and they both hate the United States for reasons that may be slightly different. But I think to talk about the Russia-China military alliance against the liberal international order dominated by the United States is a little bit too premature.
Uh-huh. Fascinating. I have a follow-up question, but I wonder if I could just get you to unpack one thing you said, because I didn't totally understand what you were saying. And that's the connection between the Russian invasion of Crimea and the and Central Asia. How are these connected?
Well, because Russia's gambit in Ukraine was severely sanctioned by the West, led by the United States. And Russia basically, become very isolated in that area. And then also because of our reassertion in many areas in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean area, Russia sort of lost its primary weapons buyers, Libya, for example. So Russia has to really expand its global weapons sales market, which is a pillar of the Russian economy. So that's why Central Asia becomes very important. However, Central Asia people, because of rising nationalism, are also being put away by Putin's own blunders. For example, his relationship with Bayev in Kazakhstan used to be pretty solid, and it didn't work out very well because Putin made some very, very derogatory comments about the Kazakhs. And the same thing goes on with the Belarus. Lukashenko is openly in rebellion against Putin in a way. So I think that the Middle East is going to play a very important role in the global power competition context between Russia, China, and the United States.
In the tensions that you name between the Russians and the Chinese, is there a role that the United States can play in exacerbating those tensions, or should we just stand back and just benefit from them and not much we can do?
No, we can do a lot. And if you 50 years from now, if you look at the Trump administration's foreign policy legacy, the biggest legacy will be President Trump single-handedly changed the global dialogue about China. And that really needs a lot of work, thinking to do. That is the first and foremost. In order to do that, in order to consider China as the #1 national security threat to the United States, we would have to decouple from the idea somehow Russia presents an existential threat to the United States and the Western world. Russia is a threat, but is not nearly as existential as China is. So the problem is that in the United States, Russia in American politics is a very toxic topic. You cannot talk about getting closer to Russia strategically without risking your political life. And we have seen that since 2016 election. So that is the most unfortunate American reality. And we have to do it very, very quickly. And we have to do it very carefully, but decisively, because Russia and China share some of the, maybe not ideologically, but I think we do share a lot of global security interest in the context of China's rise as a global threat. Secretary Pompeo mentioned it several months ago in London, and he still insists today, and I think he's absolutely correct, that the China threat is the central threat of our times. And that to face that threat, we must work with the Russians in many aspects.
Very interesting. I was Glenn. I was hoping to get a little bit of a disagreement between you and Miles, but I suspect from the tenor of what you said before and what Miles just said, there isn't much disagreement there. Am I right, or do you have a slightly different perspective?
No, I don't. I think the Russians are very uneasy with the rise of China, and you can see a lot of that emerging in the Arctic and how they approach the Arctic and Chinese pretensions in the Arctic and their exploration efforts. So I think there are some underlying tensions there, but the bottom line is that Russia, as the United States tried to, and the Trump administration tried to invite, or it hoped to invite Putin to the G7 meeting. I think our core issue is that we don't understand that Putin is not going to do anything to undermine his relationship with Xi, and this is very important in terms of how they're balancing, because they want to remain aligned with China, But in the same way, they're also pursuing issues in a sub-regional level, and first and foremost for them is driving a wedge in NATO through their ties with Turkey. And so there is this effort to spin and balance by the Russians, but they no doubt that in the long term they are very weary of Russia, but in the immediate short term they're not, because they view China as basically as China's got their back, and allows them to pursue other initiatives like their intervention in Libya, for example.
So let me take you back to the earlier issue that you raised of Turkey, because it wasn't that long ago, when President Trump announced the withdrawal from northeast Syria, that a lot of experts in Washington were saying that Erdogan is basically Putin's pawn, or at least his ally. We'd handed Syria to the Russians and the Iranians, and so on and so forth. And I think that it's pretty easy to show these days that that those predictions were totally false. We see in the last round of fighting in Idlib, we saw a lot of tension, and not just tension, conflict between the Russians and the Turks, and certainly the Turks and the Iranians. And we also see the Turks and the Russians on opposite sides elsewhere. I mean, most notably these days in Libya, but that's not the only place. In Ukraine, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and elsewhere, there are tensions. Do you see a way that we can use the Turkish power against the Russians, or to put pressure on the Russians?
Absolutely. I think one of the key things about Nixon and the Nixon doctrine was that a reliance upon regional proxies. When the United States withdrew out of Vietnam, we started shifting to the Shah of Iran as a major power to rely upon in the Gulf. And as we diminished and reduced our footprint around the world, and I think we're in a similar type of predicament as the announcement with the withdrawal of U.S. forces, 10,000 men from Germany. We're going to have to start increasingly relying on regional powers like Turkey, that are very anxious to fill this vacuum and to deter Russia to pursue its own national interests in the Mediterranean. So I think as we're kind of reassessing our role in the Mediterranean, we're going to have to understand that Turkey is very determined to play a role there, and Turkey is going to. We kind of misunderstood Turkey because of the Gulen coup that was tried to undermine Turkey. I think a lot of people misread Turkey because they didn't understand the internal problems and struggles they were having. But Turkey's emerged from that now in a much stronger program. I mean, this is a country that's getting ready at the end of this year to deploy its first aircraft carrier. And this is going to have a major, impact on the Eastern Med in terms of Turkish naval power, which we really haven't seen since basically the 15th century. So this is, and again, going back to your point, I don't think the Russians are going to go head to head with the Turks in Libya for the sake of losing their greater interest with Turkey. I mean, the trade dimension with them is very important. And I think Erdogan, with his phone call yesterday and the discussion with President Trump, I mean, there's a determination at Turkey to play a role that's remaining aligned with the U.S. And I mean, with the second largest army in NATO, I mean, Turkey cannot be ignored, but their interests right now are focused on the Med and the exclusive economic zones. That's why they're in Libya, because they view Libya as a part of the division of the Eastern Med in terms of the exclusive economic zones that were declared by the Greek Cypriots and Greece. To be against their interests, and they're going to determine to fulfill their interests in the Eastern Med, and they will go head to head with whoever they can, just as they did when they went into Cyprus in '75. So this is very, it's critical that we understand what their interests are. I think it's interesting that you're starting to see a reassessment by Sisi, and apparently he didn't want to meet with Haftar this weekend. So there's some reassessments going on by Egypt, but certainly when you have in Libya, of all things, you have 400,000 Libyans of Turkish descent, which astounds a lot of people by those ties. But Turkey has long-lasting ties in terms of Libya that we wouldn't have even thought about 5 years ago. Ataturk fought in Libya in 1911, and the Turks were at that time were masters of irregular warfare using the tribes. And I think in many ways the Turks will I mean, they went head to head with the Russians in Idlib and in February with their drone blitzkrieg. And I think there's some things in technologically, militarily, that we are missing in understanding where Turkey's going. And I think it can play the U.S. interest in the long term. So
I mean, it's striking to me that that Libya, which is right on Europe's border, Europe has vital interests there with regard to immigration, with regard to oil, and the two players that are most important these days are the Russians and the Turks, or the Russians, the Turks, the Egyptians, and the UAE. But where are the Europeans? I mean, so if we could get Turkey, get relations between the West and Turkey in a better position, Turkish power could be working to shore up the kind of European periphery. That's the way I see it. That's what you're saying, are you not?
yes, and that's why you see Italy pretty much closely aligned with Turkey and Libya. And they also have a natural gas pipeline that goes under the sea that goes from Libya, and so they have some interest mutually there. But you also have in Libya, you have other countries involved, like the Emiratis, that are funding Haftar and playing a role with their drones and their military forces on the ground, and along with the Russian Wagner mercenaries. But I think in the long term, I think Turkey's going to win. They will go head to head with them, but I think the Russians will not, in the long term, try to play a role that they want to be a spoiler. They want interests at the table. There was officials from the GNA government were in Moscow recently. They're still playing all sides, and they're playing sides with the Benghazi parliament. Saleh, they've been trying to, they realize they bet on the wrong horse with Haftar. Now they're shifting their position in Libya, but they ultimately want a seat at the table. But the Turks, I think the Turks eventually were playing the long game and will win there. And I think it'll have a pretty big impact on the Eastern Med. I mean, you're looking now at Israeli rapprochement with Turkey, with El Al returning, flying back to Ankara. So you're starting to see a shifting position of a rapprochement, warming in relations between Israel and Turkey, which we've needed for quite a while. And so there's a lot of shifting things going on in the Eastern Med in terms of, and it's not just the Russians. That's my point.
Well, I'm glad you raised the Israel question. Well, I think we got time for one more round here. And Secretary Schenker, let me put the Israel question to you in the context of this great power competition. Secretary Pompeo recently made a surprise trip to Israel. The press said that one of the major subjects of discussion was the Israeli-Chinese relations. We know the press never lies and never gets anything wrong. But I wonder, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you were on that trip, and I wonder if you could give us a little bit of a sense of the flavor of the conversation, if not that particular conversation, just the conversation with the Israelis in general. And I think this is a particularly interesting one because it relates to the great power competition in the Middle East in all realms, but the Israelis, being a cyber superpower, are on the cutting edge of the innovative technologies, which is at the forefront of the Chinese plan to supplant the United States as the dominant power in the world. And so, how do we, I'm trying to wrap my head around this problem of competing with an authoritarian or Leninist capitalist country that's also a tech innovator. Where do we draw the red lines with our allies in order to make sure that they're not trading with the Chinese in a way that can actually benefit the Chinese strategically against us?
Well, you got a bunch of questions there, Mike. I mean, first, we're not telling states that they have to choose between the United States and China. We want everybody to have healthy relationship with a broad range of states. That said, we talk to states, we talk to Israel about how we see China as an actor and the perils of trading with China. You and I were both in the Bush administration. I was in DOD at the time, in OSD policy. You remember, it's only 15 years ago, right, that Israel was considering selling the Falcon the China airborne AWACS system. The Bush administration said no. Then Israel went and sold the Harpy to China, changed a cross-strait balance, and eventually the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Doug Feith, PNG'd Amos Yaron, the Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Essentially, the Deputy Secretary of Defense of Israel was fired. He was not allowed into the Pentagon anymore and was fired from the Israeli government. Right? That was only 15 years ago. Right? So China has the potential to be an irritant in U.S.-Israeli relations. Right? We want none of that. Right? Israel is an amazing partner. We have a broad range of cooperation with them. It's deep. It's beneficial. They are an ally par excellence. So we just want to put it on the table and tell them where we're at and tell them as an ally, like so many other partners of ours, that we want them to do some due diligence on what they're doing with China. Right? We have here CFIUS, we have FIRMA, we have the Export Control Act. We, as a whole of government, look at what we're doing with China, if anyone wants to do business with China, and we make a decision based on our national interests, right? This is the law in the United States. They don't have any such thing currently in Israel. They have something that is voluntary, that doesn't pertain to high tech. They got to fix that. We're working with them to try and improve how they analyze these things, because they are a great ally, and we don't want any misunderstandings. So I think it was a very productive trip in that regard. But we're not going to, if Israel wants to sell Tnuva, right, their leading dairy company to China, that's their business. I don't know if you'd want to sell your leading food company, given China's food, health, safety regulations, to a Chinese company. But it's another story if you want to go with Huawei. It undermines how we work together as strategic partners. So I think we just had a very nice and straightforward talk with Israel about this. And the good thing about being such great allies is that we can have what are at times difficult conversations.
Thank you. Professor Yu, I wonder if I could put the same question to you, just in general terms. How should we be thinking about this this competition in high tech? How do we send a clear signal to our allies of where the red lines are?
Okay, great. That's a great question. Now, China distinguished itself from the old adversaries, the Soviet Union, in the sense that China is heavily integrated in the global economy. Soviet Union was almost entirely isolated from that. China also has another very big distinction, that China is technologically much more capable than the Soviet in terms of controlling global communication network, influence how other people conduct its infrastructure in telecommunication. So that's why it's very, very important. Secretary Pompeo spent an enormous amount of energy telling the allies, friends and allies alike, how important it is to keep the critical infrastructure and particularly communication networks away from the Chinese, because 5G actually, it's a very uncompromising technology. The difference between core and edge in 5G is very, very narrow. Once you are in the system, even on the edge, and then you penetrate into the core. So Secretary Pompeo actually made a trip to Israel last year, I believe, and he was specifically mentioned in the harshest tone that if Israel would go ahead allowing China's Huawei or 5G technology into infrastructure, the U.S.-Israeli intel sharing would suffer. Now, that's really, really good way to communicate with the friends and allies, because only through candor can friends and allies strengthen that relationship. So the Chinese design in Israel obviously is very, very clear, as the Secretary Schenker mentioned. Israeli is technologically capable. Israel play a very important role in the in Eastern Mediterranean. So China really aimed Israel to continue its port acquisition, for example. And China wants to extend the Belt and Road Initiative in Israel. And China definitely want to engage with Israeli industries at the sub-national level. So they want to buy many of the Israeli companies. And so the government did not know. So we talked to the Israelis and telling them, hey, listen, you guys should really strengthen your export control and your screening for national security concern of any of the deals with the Chinese. So I think that's a very, very good approach. Now, having said that, we have to point out that no administration has done more to Israel than this one on many of the, not only rhetorically, but also substantially. So Israel and the United States relationship is as strong as ever, but we have to point out the danger posed by China in that particular region.
Thanks a lot. Glenn, I wonder if I could put a similar question to you. I'm particularly curious how it is that the Russians can make these advanced weapon sales to the Chinese, given that the weapon sales is such an important part of the Russian economy. Aren't they afraid that the Chinese are just going to take all of their technology and duplicate it and then leave them in the dust? Is that an area where the United States and Russia actually have a kind of shared interest to prevent the Chinese from becoming the #1 innovator in the world?
No, definitely. They've always been highly conscious of the technology transfers to China, and they're quite aware that that China's reverse engineering Russian air defense weaponry, aircraft, virtually everything, and now turning right around and exporting it to Pakistan. So these are areas that the Russians are conscious of. But the point is that again, they want to give the Chinese enough weaponry to be able to take on and tie down the United States, and they know this. But the problem with the Russians is that they're still fielding a lot of equipment and weaponry with airframes and designs, weapons designs from the 1980s, and they're having some difficulties in trying to make that jump with the technology. And this is where the case in point with Turkey I find very interesting is the Turks are quite able to get access to technology and to actually outdrone Israel, which I find interesting because of their investments in technology. And they've basically leapfrogged the Russians in that area.
Sorry, sorry to intervene there, to interrupt. When you say that the Turks have outdroned Israel, are you saying that the Turkish drones are more advanced than Israel's, or that Turkey is playing a bigger role in the global markets than Israel?
I think that if you look at the trends now, North Africa and Ukraine, the biggest, second largest importer of Turkish drones is now Ukraine, and they're going to start building these. So my point here is that the Turks have done a wonderful job at integrating drone technology combined with jamming systems on the ground, and in using that with their air defense assets. They did this masterfully in Idlib. And I think the Russians realize this. They know they got clobbered by the Turks, and it surprised them. And now the Russians are going back to the drawing board asking questions. But the Turks, because they couldn't get access to our drone technology, went out on the market and started developing their own drones and capacity, building on what they had with their cooperation with Israel in the mid-90s. They've taken these drones and they've refined them, but the key term here is integration. They've learned how to integrate these with combined different land-air operations that the Russians were really surprised at how well they did it, and they're replicating that on the ground now in Libya. And that's what I find interesting is that they're going head-to-head with the Chinese drones in Libya. The Winglung 2 is being dropped right and left by the Turks using air defense, using some of their frigates offshore with air defense weaponry, and they're doing it. They're integrating this, and they weren't. The point is, they weren't really sitting around. They've been working on this for quite a while, and I think it surprised a lot of people, and it certainly shocked the Russians. To now that the Russians are quite weary of the Turks in these areas, and so that's one of my answer. Mike.
All right, well, fantastic. Gentlemen, I want to thank you. I think it's about time to bring this to an end, but let me just make sure make sure you don't have any closing remarks. Assistant Secretary Schenker, do you have anything you want to close with?
No, it's good to be with you, and Miles and Glenn. Thanks for having me.
Okay, Professor Yu, do you have any final thoughts for us?
I think one of the very important aspects of China's military rise has to be with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been instrumental in China's military modernization in the last 30 years. Ukrainians, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, possess a massive amount of Russian military technology and heavy weapons. So they sold at a fractional price to the Chinese. China has hired more than 2,000 Ukrainian weapons experts in the last 20-some years to China to help with the modernization gambits. Every single major platform in Chinese People's Liberation Army's warehouse, from aircraft carrier to turbofan engine for its heavy bombers to its amphibious landing craft, the LCAC, are from the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have been undercutting Russia's weapon sale to China at a great discounted price. And that's one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin has been really, really frustrated, even mad at the Ukrainians in that particular aspect. So there's a very, very powerful dynamics between the great power competitions in the context of Russia and China and Ukraine.
That's fascinating. Could you go so far as to say that that Putin's decision to go into Ukraine was in part, maybe even just a small part, motivated by that competition over arms sales?
I think for the Ukrainians, they are very close to Russia, obviously, but also during a time of crisis, Ukrainians tried to find the third way, and they tried to get the protection from the Chinese. Remember, during the height of the Maidan protest of 2013, 2014, Yanukovych, who was a Putin acolyte, went to Beijing and signed a treaty with the Chinese, where the Chinese will provide nuclear umbrella for Ukraine in case of a nuclear attack against Ukraine by the third country. Now, that could only be one country, that's Russia. So incidents like that really, really sour the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And I think Russia has a long-standing grievance against Ukraine for its gradual closing up to the Chinese and leading up to 2014 annexation of Crimea.
That's an analysis that I never heard before. Very interesting. Thank you. With that, we'll move to Glenn. And Glenn, do you have anything you'd like to say to that, or any closing remarks?
Well, I think that, yeah, I think there's a lot of geopolitical shifting going on in the Eastern Med, and the paradigms that we had for the region are shifting and changing. And I think that this is something that's going to affect U.S. policy, and everything is integrated. What the Russians are doing in Crimea is connected to the Mediterranean and relations with China as well. I think there's a certain balancing going on, and I think we need to be aware of that. I think the key thing that the trends that are emerging is that we can't leave countries like Libya alone, that the Russians will find a way to as they say in the Middle East, to get the camel for its nose, to get its nose under the tent. And that's what's happening here. And I think that this is, we need to keep an eye on this, but there's a certain balancing role the United States can play in all this. I think that in the long run will further its own interests.
Well, thanks very much, Glenn. And gentlemen, thanks to all of you. It's been really great having you, very enlightening. My head is spinning a bit from all this, but I think my thinking has been very much enriched by it. Once again, really appreciate you coming, and we hope to have you back here soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mike.